Brothers and sisters, we've been speaking about the need to strive for an intense interior life. The last video we ended by saying that depending on our degree of union with God, with His light, with His grace, depending on this union, will really affect our actions, our words, and the kind of impact we will have in life. In other words, what will save the church and what will transform this world is radical holiness, which is our complete growing in the life of God. In baptism, divine life began in us. God is living in us in the state of grace. And so how do we grow in this life? How do we live this interior life of participating in God's life in a more intense way, so that we will have an impact on the world, that we will radiate His light and change lives? And so Archbishop Martinez has some really interesting things to talk about this dilemma, this problem, you could say, about how do we grow in the interior life. And he notes some things that are very helpful. And I'm going to just read from him and maybe give some commentary. And he says, basically, the problem that we have to solve is this: how shall we proceed that our interior life may become more intense day by day, and that we will be able to realize our ideal of becoming saints and the purpose of our life, which is to reach heaven and reach that complete union with God. Now he says, in order to solve this problem, he will not give us a whole bunch of tools and regulations and observations, but rather he's going to more about disclose a key. And we're not going to speak about the key exactly today, but maybe in the next day or two, so stay tuned. But we have to set up the scene to arrive at this special key, and I think it will bring our whole reflection of these weeks to a nice fulfillment. And so he says that we basically, this key will be disclosed to us. And he says that, first of all, we need to recognize that in the spiritual life, there are times where we have sweet days and where we have bad days. And sometimes the harder days outweigh the good days. And so we need to be very much aware of this rhythm between the consolations and the desolations of life. And you know, he says, who has not had times more or less extended when he was able, without any difficulty, to live for days filled with fervour? The pity is that we have not been able to determine why or how we arrived at this state. So in other words, we might not be super conscious about the states of our soul and what caused it, what triggered it, maybe what might take away our interior joy. You know, we live in a world of many thieves are there to steal our peace and our joy, and we need to become attentive about the inner workings of the spiritual life in conjunction to the world that we're in. He says, one fine day we perceived ourselves recollected. The presence of God became very easy for us. Our soul was at rest and we enjoyed a period of peace. But the next day, everything seems to have faded away and waned. And our fervour seems to have departed. You know, we become dry. We feel like we've lost all desire for God and for holy things. And unfortunately, since the bright days are few and the overcast ones are more frequent, we do not know by a fixed rule over many and long periods of time what we must do to cultivate the interior life. Some souls even believe that fervour is a sort of a lottery prize. In other words, that he whose turn it is to win, wins, and he whose turn it is not has nothing to do but resign himself. And so he's saying that, you know, is your happy days just a matter of lottery? Or are you living in a deliberate way your spiritual life so that, you know, that you could find joy and peace in the midst of affliction? In other words, that your life won't just be a big cloud of doom. And he says, if only we could discover the thread of this labyrinth, the key of the interior life, so that we might know what we have to do both on the bright days and on the cloudy and overcast ones. So he goes on and says, we might attempt to solve the problem in a superficial manner and enumerate all the elements from which the interior life takes. For example, we might start to speak about interior and exterior recollection, overcoming self-love, purity of the heart. In other words, talking about all these things that might easily attribute to this change between the good days of brightness and consolation and desolation. You know, he speaks about that we might analyze the fact that is our heart empty of all created things? Are we practicing virtue, etc.? In other words, trying to ascertain this shift in consolation. Thus, the problem would be solved by saying that the soul must intensify all these elements in order that the interior life might grow and develop. But the question would still stand, and the soul would ask anew, how does one acquire recollection, empty the heart, and practice the virtues? For many times the soul desires recollection and cannot achieve it. Neither can anyone empty the heart perfectly except by filling it with God through the medium of the interior life. Nor can anyone practice the virtues perfectly except by holding before the eyes of the soul the divine model, Jesus Christ, whom we contemplate and pray. Hence, we do not so much need to know the elements of the interior life and the means that favor it as to discover the key, the central point.